All right, everyone, now it's time for some fascinating anthropological news and new archaeological finds in the Amazon that have been studied for a long time. They've found that there's a new culture. Well, I mean, they knew that there was a culture there, but they found new remains there through ground imaging and so forth that are commensurate in the middle of the Amazon rainforest, where 100 years ago they thought nothing was going on other than some hunter-gatherers, maybe a few horticulturalist tribes that, sort of did rotary planting. That was generally conceived of as all that was going on in the Amazon. This script began to change quite some time ago with the finding of Terra Preta, actually. An area the size of England in the middle of the Amazon rainforest that has been clearly altered by humans and turned into a very rich... Normally the soil there is rather poor, but they enriched it using charcoal. Potsherds and so forth were found in it. And bones and other remains were ground up into it, forming a thick layer of soil that clearly involved a gargantuan amount of human effort to create. Again, we're talking an area the size of England. Now we're finding that they had a road system, and they had sort of raised plazas on which probably public gatherings or rituals or something were held, possibly commerce related. You'd have vendors and stuff like that. We're talking about a sophisticated culture. One that was not previously understood to exist at all. I find this fascinating because it points to the human timeline and how little we actually know about it. If you go back 100 years, the general consensus is things really don't really start cooking up until Egypt forms. And then it gets pushed back kind of to Samaria and the latter-day Babylonians, of course, inhabiting the same region, the Assyrians and Hittites and all these tribes. And it was all very Bible-based, so basically if your state was mentioned in the Bible, then you're part of the historical record. And originally, prior to colonial contact, it wasn't understood that anything was going on to the west. Then the Americas are discovered and people start finding mounds and all sorts of cool shit and stone cairns in New England that date back centuries, and they're not Victorian remains, by the way, they're clearly more ancient than that. And we didn't know that the Vikings had reached the Americas. We now know that they have. That research was still ongoing in the 70s and 80s. It wasn't until fairly recently with the discovery of certain iron axes and things like that, and clearly European skeletal remains, that it was finally attributed to, hey, yeah, I guess somebody came here before Christopher Columbus. It wasn't even known until fairly recently in the human timeline. Again, in the Amazon, not much is going on, supposedly, until fairly recent times. We now know that to be completely untrue. This network of what appeared to be villages and towns were interconnected by roads that had a curb on the side and everything else. This points to a significant human effort. It doesn't point to a small human effort. It must have required many, many decades and labor force at least in the tens of thousands. That speaks to an organizational capacity that's far beyond horticultural tribes. Look at Göbekli Tepe and some of the remains there in Turkey and the areas adjacent. Until fairly recently, again, we're talking about Samaria effectively being the dawn of civilization. Then you find remains that are thousands of years older, clearly, again, were constructed by people that had to have had an organizational capacity. Teams of hunter-gatherers would not have had the reason, the resources, or the availability of time to create such a large megalithic structure as we find at Göbekli Tepe, and there are structures now that are understood to be even older than that. Catalhoyuk, which was, I think, 9,000 BC or thereabouts, required significant sophisticated organization beyond simply a small tribe. It was far too large to have been constructed by a small group of people. It quite clearly involved a population that even at its low points was in the hundreds. And I believe several thousand, possibly at peak, was the estimate based on the number of little crevices and nooks and crannies there. I think they counted the hearths and then estimated the size of families more than anything else. These finds are fascinating because this is yet another culture about which relatively little is known. They had to have had a state or a sub-state organizational concept in mind in order to have linked up this many villages and towns, of which I guess most of the plazas are square, some of them are circular. This also points to, again, differential ideas growing within that culture about that organization, etc. It points to probably the individual sovereignty of these specific units that were interlinked working together at a greater level for some common good. It was probably related to trade and travel. It's like, hey, instead of getting lost in the trees between our towns, we can link the two towns together with a road, and we never get lost again. And it just makes we can make it nice and smooth, and you know, we can walk on it more easily, we can move faster. It'll make things easier when we're dragging the sledge or using the wagon or whatever the hell they would have had, and it would have been easier life for them. It would have required maintenance too, which would have required cooperation between these different units of people, which could have been expanded like, you know, multifamily tribes, but they're working together as effectively a singular entity for their organizational purposes. There's evidence of agriculture in between these little villages as well. This is an expansive area too, so this isn't, you know, 2 or 3 tribes on an island decided to put markers along the sand and the rocks and shit in order to find one another more easily. This is an expansive area. This is effectively a collection, it appears, of city-states. Well, again, until recently, that sort of capacity was not understood to exist in that particular location in the time period that we're thinking about. Utterly fascinating. I love archaeology, in case you didn't know. Studied it at UVM. That's about all. Peace out.